my dissertation research in Tanzania from 1996 to 1998. I was looking at the impact of the refugee presence in Western Tanzania. So I spent a lot of time out in that area and did more than 1,000 interviews and was talking with people and got a real sense of sort of both positive and negative effects of the refugee presence. And there was lots of nuance, and some people had really benefited from the refugees being there and others had not. And yet then when I would go for R&R and spend some time in Dar es Salaam or in Zanzibar, and people asked me, oh, what are you doing here? And I would explain what I was studying out in Western Tanzania, they would say, oh, it's a horrible situation out there. It was, from their perspective, it was all bad. Everything related to the refugees was all bad, which was not the nuance that I found when I was actually in the refugee affected areas. And so I was very intrigued by this dichotomy, but it wasn't the main focus of my research. And so I sort of put it on the back burner. But this idea that sort of being farther away and not experiencing the direct effects of being near the border somehow have this very blanket perception of it, this very negative perception. So fast forward then to just the past few years, some data became available to really explore this more. And that's particularly through the Afrobarometer. Some of you may be familiar with Afrobarometer, but it does surveys in many countries throughout Africa and collects data. And in the 2014-15 round, they asked a question about free movement across borders and whether people supported it or not. And they also now are georeferencing their data, so you know where the different respondents are within a country, so you know how close to the border they are. So that sort of then created the opportunity to go back to some of my earlier questions on this and do a project in this area. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the beginning parts here. I think many people are familiar with this. Obviously, we have sort of a border theme in this conference this year. But often borders are sort of portrayed as barriers, but also they are areas of opportunity and risk. So you have opportunities in terms of trade and smuggling and crossing the border to have better prices or services. Obviously, for refugees, there's the opportunity of seeking safety across the border. But then there are risks associated with being near a border, which can include if there's a conflict going on, cross-border attacks, for example, refugee influxes, perhaps other security issues. So really what I'm trying to understand is sort of how these different opportunities and risks affect people's support for free movement across borders, particularly those who live close to those borders. And I'm focusing on Africa in part because I'm an Africanist, of course, but also I think this is a really interesting place to look at this because of the relatively recent imposition of borders, the fact that borders are relatively porous and easy to cross in many places, but not all. We just heard this morning about borders in Southern Africa, for example, that are quite difficult, particularly South Africa. But this region in general has often been overlooked in a lot of the work on sort of public opinion research and things on attitudes towards borders and to immigrants and the like. So the literature, to the extent that there is some literature on sort of how people's proximity to an international border influences public opinion. There's been some work in Europe on attitudes towards regional integration, generally finding that people who live closer to borders are more likely to support European integration. There's been some work on immigration attitudes, although mixed findings. Some of it has suggested that people who are closer to borders are more opposed to immigration, others suggesting that they're more supportive of immigration. And there's been some really recent work on border security, and particularly in the US on support for the border wall along the US-Mexico border. Again, with some mixed findings. Some of the interesting stuff there, though, is that you interact it with partisanship and you see different things. So Republicans, for example, who live closer to the border have more diversity of views about the border. But if you ask a Republican in like Iowa, far from the border, they're like universally opposed to border crossings and they want the wall. And there's a lot of, some of these authors sort of suggest that it has to do with listening to the national discourse and the national political rhetoric as opposed to actually experiencing any impact of the border. And so that's part of what you get to, right, is some of the things that the mechanisms that may relate to this are things like, do you have contacts across the border? Can you take advantage of these things? What is the media saying about these things? To what extent do you experience threats? So these are some of the sort of mechanisms that people talk about when they're thinking about why proximity to a border would influence your public opinion on some of these issues. So the hypotheses that I'm sort of looking at here are first that people who live closer to the border, to an international land border, are more likely to support free movement than people living farther away. And I developed this I do have a working paper on this if people are interested, but I developed this and sort of suggest that those opportunities of the border would seem in many cases to outweigh any risks. But that also, the second hypothesis I have here is that you'll see more variation in support for open borders in border areas because of those risks as well. So you might have some people really opposed to open borders and some people really supportive, whereas you'd probably see more uniform sentiment further away from the borders. So as I said, what made this possible was the fact that there's Afrobarometer survey data. And so I'm using data from nearly 45,000 respondents in 32 countries. This round of the survey was done in 36 countries, but 4 of those are island countries. So I, of course, excluded them because they don't share land borders with any other country. And the main dependent variable that I'm using to look at this is agreement with the statement that people living in this part of Africa, wherever they were, should be able to move freely across international borders in order to trade or work in other countries. And because it was georeferenced data, I'm able to calculate their distance from the border. So for some of these things, I sort of look at the total kilometers from the border. I take the log of that. And other things, I just look, are they within a border area or not, which I sort of arbitrarily defined as being within 100 kilometers of the border. You can debate that. It's going to be arbitrary in any way. But that seems to be a distance within which people can sort of take advantage of some of those opportunities of the borders. And then there's also some other individual questions that are asked in the Afrobarometer, things like, do you get remittances, which you would expect people who get remittances maybe have a more positive attitude towards open borders because they have somebody who's crossed those borders. Living conditions is sort of a measure of its relative living conditions. Do you consider yourself to be better off compared to people around you? So that's sort of a measure of income. Do you have is there a secondary degree? So education, age, and gender are things that have been associated with attitudes towards borders and towards immigration in past studies. So this is just a map that shows the different countries in which the survey was conducted and also the locations of the respondents, right? So it gives you an idea of what the geocoding allows you to do. I had to learn GIS for this. I don't know it very well, but I was very proud of myself when I was able to create the map. So I wanted to be sure to include it. So this is like a very quant thing. And I just want to show you that the initial variable sort of was, it's basically, do you support this statement for free movement or a different statement that's opposed to free movement? And so it was basically a 1 to 5 scale. And this is looking at just on answering that question. If you look here, people within the border area had sort of 3.4 or 3.5 nearly out of 5 support for free movement, compared to outside the border area, it was lower. And this may seem like a very small difference, but when you're talking about 45,000 respondents, it's actually statistically significant. But the other thing that's really interesting and goes against my second hypothesis is that the standard deviation of those responses is actually smaller in the border area. So more concentration of opinion, more consistent opinion in the border area than outside the border area where there's more variation. So that actually goes against the second hypothesis. But I want to sort of show more visually with some more complicated analyses, but I only have figures, not tables. To show really what the relationship is between proximity to the border and support for free movement across the border. So this one is just from a basic model I did where the dependent variable is, do you support free movement across the border or not? Based on, okay, thanks Todd, 5 minutes. And then these are the different control variables or independent variables that I included in this. And you see what these lines mean, or so the dot sort of shows whether that is associated with a higher likelihood of supporting free movement. And the line on either side of the dot is what we call the confidence interval. It's essentially sort of the what do you call that, margin of error type thing. So it's only if that line does not cross the center line that you can say that there's a statistically significant effect. But you notice that in this top line, people who live in a border area are significantly more likely to support free movement than people who do not live in a border area. Also, people who receive remittances, more likely to support free movement. No statistically significant effect of living conditions, secondary degree, or age. And women are significantly less, though it's obviously almost touching that line, but they are significantly less likely to support free movement. than men. So the next one actually goes based on the distance from the border. And you can see, so along the bottom line here, you have 0 kilometers from the border all the way up to more than 600 kilometers from the border. And basically your predicted probability based on the responses to this survey and all of this data of supporting free movement across the border when you're near the border is above 65%. But as you move, it sort of drops quickly. And as you move farther and farther away from the border, that predicted probability of supporting free movement across the border drops. Now you're still talking about above 55%, right? And the majority of people in the survey did support free movement across the border, but it does decline. It varies some based on where you are in proximity. So just in the moments I have left, I will say that one question I had is sort of, is this driven by co-ethnicity, right? Is this driven by the fact that people in border areas may share an ethnic identity with somebody on the other side of the border? And so what I was able to do is it reduced the number of respondents in here because the ethnicity was not asked in every country and not everybody responded. But I basically matched that up, their ethnic identity with a list of partitioned ethnic groups. So ethnic groups that were, a line was drawn through them when the borders were drawn. And so what I found, I thought was really interesting, which is that even once you factor that in, people in border areas are significantly more likely to support free movement. However, people who identify with an ethnic group that was partitioned by the border are actually much less likely to support free movement across the border. And my own sort of working theory on this, though I'd be open to ideas, is that perhaps that takes away some of the advantages that they may have when there are restrictions at the border. They can draw on their co-ethnicity with people across the border to trade and other things, and use those networks. But when it's free movement across the border, that takes away the advantage that they may have from that co-ethnic identity. So that's sort of what I'm working on now, but I'm planning to do a lot more research in this area to try to identify these mechanisms a little bit more. I also look at, this is complicated to get into, but I also look at it, are they affected by being close to a refugee camp? So I was able to use geocoded data where refugee camps were located at the time that the survey was done. And basically what this shows is that, again, if you're in a border area, the red line at the top, you're always more likely to support free movement, but it actually goes up if you're also close to a refugee camp. Whereas if you're not in a border area, the blue line here, if you're close to a refugee camp, your likelihood of supporting free movement across the border actually is much lower. And these are all statistically significant. So it's sort of interesting to pay attention to that. So I do find evidence then that people living closer to the border are more likely to support free movement, but not that their sentiment is sort of more widespread, more diverse. In fact, it seems to be more concentrated. So support for the first hypothesis and against the second hypothesis that I had. This sort of summarizes, it doesn't seem to be driven by co-ethnicity. It doesn't seem to be driven by proximity to refugee camps, and in fact, maybe works differently than one would expect. I did another analysis that looks at whether they support having immigrant neighbors, and it's sort of consistent with these findings. So now sort of the next step is to try to figure out what's working, like what are the mechanisms that are leading to this? Is it that people in these border areas have more cross-border contacts? That wasn't asked in the Afrobarometer survey, so I need to do some more research on that. Is there a lot of control at the nearest border or not? What is now, collecting new data now that we've had all these border controls related to the pandemic? This was all data obviously collected well before COVID. So I think these are all really interesting things to pursue, and that's sort of where I'm going in some of the future research that I plan to do, getting back out to some countries to test this. So thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Beth. Our next, Wycliffe, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll pick up from where Beth left about the migration and the perception. I know migration is a very controversial issue, especially in Africa. And some of us have experienced it because we are also immigrants. So as I talk about sport, it is just one aspect of the big picture about population migration and the like. So I'm going to talk about migration destination patterns for East African soccer players. And basically for me, the purpose is here is just to determine where these soccer players go to play their game when they leave their home countries. And I'm focusing on Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda. But before I go into the data in terms of movement, there are a number of researchers that have focused mainly on what they have come to term as sports labor migration. And they have generated some typologies that explain the characteristics of the different migrant players around the world. So Maguire and McGee and Sagden, they have developed some of the typologies that a lot of researchers have used to contextualize the movement patterns of athletes around the globe. Now, for Maguire, he came up with this typology that characterizes these athletes as, categorize them as mercenaries, as nomads, as cosmopolitan, as pioneers, as returnees. And he used data from soccer, basketball, cricket, and rugby. Whereas Maggie and Sagden, they also used basically the same typology, but they gave it some variation. Then they categorized them under mercenary, settler, and nomadic, cosmopolitan, ambitionist, exile, and expelled. And in East Africa, we've witnessed a variety of those, especially when it comes to track and field. I think there has also been a lot of work that has been done on track and field, because that, I think, because it is an individual sport, a lot of athletes, even around the world now, when you look at the Olympic Games, when you look at people that start on the podium as having won medals, when you look at the person and their place of birth and the country they are representing, usually you see that there is a lot of movement that takes place. So my argument in my presentation today is that I've used these typologies also to characterize some of the movements that have originated from the East African countries mentioned. And I've come up with 4 categories. The first one is mercenary. And this is where athletes are motivated by the earning capacity in the place where they're going to play their craft. Because in East African countries, the earning power from your sporting talent is very limited. And therefore, this pushes these athletes to go to look for opportunities where they're going to get a better compensation and remuneration for their athletic effort. Then we also have the nomadic cosmopolitan category. And these ones are usually people that are basically out to go and discover the cultures around the world. Some of them could be coming towards the end of their careers, so they look for less competitive leagues where they can extend their careers. And we have examples in that category. We have an example of somebody like Mike Olunga from Kenya and Victor Wanyama from Kenya too. Some of these fellows have traveled almost 9-10 different places to play their in terms of their career. They have traversed the world, different leagues. At one time, it was moving from a lower competitive league to a higher one, but then at another point, you leave a higher one, and then you go to a lower one as you continue to age and as you prepare to retire. So those are the ones that we call nomadic cosmopolitan. And then we also have the returnees. Most of them are actually returnees, because when you analyze a lot of these athletes, whenever they are called upon to represent their country, they come back willingly. They come back to wear the national jerseys of their respective countries. And because of their experience abroad, they bring some competitive advantage to their national teams, and that has been a plus. Then we have those that have been categorized as ambitionists. Ambitionists are basically athletes that go out of the country to look for an opportunity to play at a higher compensating league and also competitive league. And this is mainly to improve their craft. And as they do that, they do it gradually so that they can continue to move from one level to another, to a higher level. And we see that. So they desire to achieve a sport career anywhere. And they also seem to have a preference for certain places where they can start and then build from that. And they also have a desire to improve their career by moving to a higher quality league. And for most African athletes, it is hard to move, for example, from Kenya to go and play in England or to go and play in Germany. So what they do is to move, maybe play in Egypt, and then from Egypt go to Middle East, and then from Middle East go to Eastern Europe, and from Eastern Europe try to get to Western Europe, where the big monies are paid. So those are people, athletes that have a serious ambition to upgrade themselves and compete at the highest level. How did I arrive at this data? I utilized the CIS Football Observatory Performance Atlas. It is a group that is based in Switzerland, and they keep a data on all the soccer players around the globe, all registered players. So they keep track on where they are playing, and they keep all that information. This data was collected on 29th of December 2020. I specify that because that was just before the new window of transfers in January 2021 opened. So some of the players could have moved to new places because there is a lot of movement that takes place every time there is a transfer window. So there are a total of 146 leagues that were analyzed, and 97 different associations were represented. And for this data, as I said, I focus on Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda. So in terms of the results, by that December 2020, there were 53 players that were playing in Division 1 leagues around the globe among the countries that were captured in this analysis. And these countries are so diverse. So out of the 53 players from the East African region, we discovered that they play in 25 different leagues across the globe. And those countries include Egypt, South Africa, USA, Turkey, Sweden, Japan, Israel, Finland, Georgia, all across the country. It is hard to pin down the favorite destinations. For Kenya, out of the 16 players on record, they are in 11 different countries. Uganda, they have 18 in 12 different countries. Tanzania, they have 8 in 6 countries. Burundi, they have 7, and each of them is in a different country, whereas Rwanda has 4, and also in 4 different countries. Now, it's interesting that Egypt, South Africa, and the USA are the most popular destinations, for they account for 32% of all the players from East Africa. Which is nice to know that I think there is some intra-African movement that is taking place, because we have always thought that it's just always south to north, but there is some intra-African movement that is building up, which is nice to know. And then the only countries that have at least one player from each East African country is Egypt and the USA. So those seem to be establishing themselves as popular destinations for East African players. Now, each of the countries of East Africa seem to have no unique destinations that have, because when you look at some of these countries where they ply their trade, there is no traditional, historically known cultural linguistic connection to each of those East African countries. So it is fascinating to know that some of these players are taking risks to go to places that are very far in terms of cultural connection, historical connections. And unlike West, Central, and North Africa, it appears that East African players have not made a major breakthrough to the top 5 leagues in the world. And those ones include the English League, the Spanish League, the German Bundesliga, Italy, and France. We at the time of this data collection, none of our players were in these leagues. Now, despite the internationalization and globalization of the footballers' labor market, access to Big Five continues to be out of reach for East African players. And that is something that I think we need a lot. The administrators of the game in the region, I'm sure they would desire that some of their players go to participate in these top tier leagues so that then they can improve the competitiveness of their national teams. There is also something that there is some channeling of migratory flows towards championships whose sporting level is a step higher than the East African football one. And that's why Egypt and South Africa seem to be popular destinations, because they have had a better track record in terms of their professional football, professional club management, and therefore compensation of players compared to East Africa, where professional football is still very much in its infancy. So Egypt, USA, South Africa, and many others are just a stepping stone for these players to go to establish themselves, and hopefully their talent can be seen and be given an opportunity to go and play at a higher level.
Wycliffe, you have 2 minutes.
Yes, there's a quote from Maya Angelou who said that about attitude: if you don't like something, change it. If you can't change it, then you change your attitude. And that speaks to our athletes from Kenya, from East Africa in general, that they can't change the way the game is managed and the way the compensation is done. So the best thing for them is then to change the attitude and go out there, take the risk of going out to have better compensation for their labor. So in conclusion, I can say that East African Association football players are widely scattered around the globe in places with minimal cultural and political ties to the region. And this shows the desire to find opportunities to earn a living from their sporting talent, irrespective of any challenges they may encounter. This is because the sporting window of talent is very limited. You can only compete between the ages of 22 to 30, 32. And if you can't get compensated well at that time, then it is going to be a long, long time of retirement in poverty. East African football has a long way to go in penetrating the top tier European leagues, unlike their counterparts from North, West, and Central Africa. And this is evident when it comes to the national team performances at the African Cup of Nations. You discover that the players that play in the top tier leagues dominate the nations that are also dominant at the African Cup of Nations level. East African players, East African countries, we fare poorly against our counterparts from the other parts of the African region. Thank you.
Thank you. That was, I suppose, our second really pretty quantitatively driven paper, which, as Beth noted, isn't always the case at CERSIS. So we're going to transition now to Matthew Angst from Jacksonville University, and the paper is titled Mapping Mobilities in Pre-Colonial and Colonial Africa. So Matthew, you have the floor, and then 15 minutes.
Let me get this shared here. All right. So I'm Matthew Angst. I'm an assistant professor of history at Jacksonville University. this will go. There we go. This is my first Sursos. Thank you to the organizers for having this. It's been a while since I've been to a conference, so it's nice to actually have something again, even in this weird form. My presentation is distinctively not quantitative. It's rather more of a critique of quantitative methods and thinking about possible alternatives. In particular, thinking about the use of GIS and other quantitative means of mapping pre-colonial and colonial Africa. If you aren't aware, there have been a ton of historical GIS projects over the last couple of decades, mapping all kinds of things. These are two examples that were very well received, one of an American city in the 20th century, the other of a British city back in the Middle Ages. These projects have been focused primarily on Europe, on the United States, at places where there's data and places where there's money. So in order to make a GIS map, it requires collecting data, plotting it, turning information into coordinates, figuring out how it fits on a map, which in many ways repeats the work of colonial cartographers. This project of collecting information that exists in many different forms and turning it into things that can be put on a map in a specific place. And so what I'm trying to do here, and haven't quite succeeded with yet, this is still something in progress, is thinking about ways in which we might be able to do this for pre-colonial, colonial African history, make those eras of the continent part of this bigger field without repeating what was done under the colonial state. So I think this also raises some bigger questions about kind of quantification of those histories as parts of the historical field move more towards quantification, possible concerns that arise with doing African history in particular before, especially before independence. So we all know the kind of history of maps and colonialism from the kind of big picture of the African continent, right? The map on the right, the product of the Berlin Conference and what Europeans thought they then knew, drawing these borders on a map, including in places they'd never been before, based on what they thought was there, to then its role in local governance, right? The mapping of ethnic groups as tribes in indirect rule, but also in other systems, right? To fix people on a map, determine this is where they belong, their homeland, and make governance easier, supposedly. But right, mapping is absolutely central to the work of colonialism in Africa, right? Part of Akil Mbembe's framework of commandement, that he sees maps as absolutely central to that repertory of European power on the continent, right? That it's cartography is just one of the many bureaucratic procedures used to reduce African territory, African people to easily managed categories. So my kind of entry into this field is thinking through how to use maps both that are in the physical form of maps and in many different forms produced by African actors in this period. My research is in Tanzania. These are both maps of Tanzania, or what's now Tanzania, drawn by caravan headmen for a German geographer in the early 20th century. The map on the left by a guy named Pesa Mbili, the map on the right by a guy named Sabatele, both of them showing the route of a caravan through the landscape of mainland Tanzania, showing different towns along the way, and was trying to incorporate these work with existing GIS systems, and was basically told, you can't do that. Or really, there are ways to do it, but that I think really don't allow us to work with the African view in this map, right? Turn it into something like what the colonial state is looking for. So here I'm trying to think of possible alternatives, exploring some of how and why. And in doing this, right, there is a challenge that some of the epistemologies of GIS are really powerful. This is from really a central book in historical GIS as method from two of the leading practitioners in the field. GIS is limitless in its applications. Everything is located someplace. We can put it on a map, stick it there, and then incorporate everything into a map with this tool. But of course, this is relatively limited, right? That actually doing this, we have a couple of options. One is something called georeferencing, which is taking a map and putting different points on it. So that's the image on the left here. Was the maker of this map took all of these points marked in red, marked them on this 19th century map, and then, or I think it's actually an 18th century map, but then marked where those points correspond to on a Mercator projection of the globe and stretch the map out, which works a little bit better for the full continent. You may get some of these maps of small areas completely stretched and distorted. But right, what this really doesn't accomplish anything, right? This takes us and turns this map created by an African into something that fits this European perspective of the time. Our other option is the work of creating a gazetteer, of taking the points on a map and locating them in latitude and longitude in Excel or some other similar program. And that's what's on the right here, that taking all of this information we have and reducing it to data points. Of course, right, the challenges go beyond, right, what scholars are doing, but the continued power politically of African colonial maps as well, right? That, of course, many people have explored the continuation of colonial era maps in post-colonial Africa, how little borders changed in the 1960s and thereafter. And so there's a political challenge, I think really a political necessity of thinking of alternatives, sort of exploring issues with borders in Africa. So the limitations of the existing techniques, right? And the most clearly, right, the necessity of quantification in turning something into a GIS map, right? That existing GIS software requires using a base map that is, right, everything on it is a point put into this bigger image. And so putting things on that map requires quantifying them as a point. The issues with georeferencing. And then finally, issues even with one of the ways in which GIS has been used in a more critical way in recent decades, what is referred to as counter mapping, a process of teaching communities to use GIS to create their own geographies, challenging state geographies. Most notably, this was used in Canada by people in the north of Canada to challenge some earlier treaty claims by the Canadian government and create a new province of Nunavut that is primarily inhabited by First Nations Canadians and is set up by members of First Nations there. In Africa, this has proved somewhat more difficult, as well as in other places. For instance, Dorothy Hodgson and Richard Schroeder did this with a few different projects done with Maasai areas in East Africa. That they said that this really didn't capture the true complexity of spatial conceptions in the area because it reduced everything to 2 dimensions. And so in order to challenge the state's cartography, the Maasai activists who created these maps had to adopt the state's cartography, adopt the state's language in order to create their challenge. So thinking about how we might decolonize maps, and this is where I'm still trying to work through what the alternatives really look like. I think one of the more obvious ones is rethinking what can be our base maps, which may be mean moving away from parts of quantification and mapping. The image here is of a map of Tenochtitlan in the 16th century in Mexico, where the scholar working with it was able to demonstrate that this map is actually created primarily by indigenous people rather than by the Spanish, but perhaps working with maps that are based in a different kind of conception of space. Secondly, thinking about how we might center movement in our maps of pre-colonial and colonial Africa. In particular, thinking about that most of our representations of space are not things that we would recognize as maps in 21st century West. Certainly, discussions of movement through space instead, other kinds of images of space that we don't necessarily see as maps, but the importance of movement to people's lives and thinking about what maps might look like that are about the way things move rather than fixing where things are. Something else that offers possibilities is a new or relatively new kind of field of marking connections between people and mapping those. Social network analysis, right? Thinking about how we might use that without perhaps a base map of where people are fixing them on a map, but thinking about mapping people and the connections between them and how those form as our basis for understanding African space. And then finally, also thinking about how we might center the orality of these cultures, right? That even if we move to more narrative forms of what's going on, that if we're still making primarily text maps, that we're working with text sources in doing this, that we're still not capturing the lived reality of these spaces and of the movement. So perhaps different ways of thinking about what maps are based in oral histories of movement through spaces. So that's what I'm still trying to think through right now. I definitely welcome any kind of feedback on how I might move forward with this, but thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. And our last presenter in the session, Kwaku Nchi from Georgia Southern University with a paper called Unrelenting Crisscrosses, Pandemic-Imposed Restrictions and the Ghana-Togo Border. So take it away, Kwaku.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so these are the arguments that I make, that the pandemic imposed restrictions on movement across the Aflao-Lomé border between Ghana and Togo have created problems not only for travelers in that part of the West African sub-region, but also for border town communities. And for local communities, these problems have been quite aggravating, given the lingering historical problems presented by the inconsiderate establishment of that boundary. Given the indispensable nature of the reasons for which border crossings happen, these limitations and closures have led to increased use of unofficial routes. So I'll go on to set the context within which these restrictions were imposed. And I guess it's commonly well known. When the WHO declared COVID-19 a global pandemic, in view of this declaration, the same organization unceasingly called on countries to take urgent and aggressive measures to change the course of the pandemic. As the pandemic worsened, countries across the world imposed a varied range of restrictions, of travel restrictions to gain time to rapidly implement effective preparedness measures. To this end, several countries in the West African sub-region, including Ghana and Togo, announced indefinite closures of their respective land, sea, and air boundaries. Okay. And at this point, I want to establish the importance, or let me say the relevance of the border we are looking at, Aflao-Lomé border. It's important to note that our border crossing within the sub-region in recent decades received a tremendous surge in view of the Economic Community of West African States, that is ECOWAS, policy to facilitate, accelerate, and standardize our development across the region. The regional body earmarked an ambitious infrastructure network in the three areas of transportation, telecommunication, and energy. The principal infrastructure on which the road transport sector hinged was the ECOWAS Regional Road Transport and Transit Facilitation Program. As part of this endeavor, the Trans-West African Coastal Highway project linked 12 countries in the southernmost part of the region. The Aflao-Lomé border precisely falls within the Lagos-Abidjan corridor of the project, making it one of the busiest in the quest to ensure freedom of movement and freedom of movement as the first principle in achieving the overarching vision of shared prosperity and well-being for all peoples within the region. So talking about the importance of this border has to do with the presence of Nigeria in the sub-region. It's quite instructive, for us to understand this. Being the most populous country, as well as one of the largest economies in Africa, Nigeria receives a large inflow of all manner of persons from different countries in the sub-region in much the same way as it produces a corresponding and potentially larger outflow of its citizens across West Africa. A greater percentage of this flow and counterflow dynamic happens across the Lagos-Abidjan corridor of the Trans-West African Coastal Highway, on which the Aflao-Lomé border perches. Therefore, this border, like others of its kind in the sub-region, remains a locus of brisk activities, including migration, trading, tourism, sightseeing, loitering, recreation, and provision of a wide range of auxiliary services. This range of brisk activities has, from distant past to contemporary times, become the bedrock of livelihoods of many individuals, as well as border towns and communities that see beckoning opportunities for economic gain near and across this international boundary. At this point, I want to move on to talk briefly about the history of the establishment of this international boundary we are talking about. The Aflao-Lomé border that serves as the official entry-exit point of the Ghana-Togo international boundary, like many of its kind across the African continent, has always been fraught with issues. It forms part of those landmark features unfortunately established according to the dictates as well as interests of colonizing European nations. These European colonial considerations received international legal recognition and entrenchment at the infamous Berlin Conference on Africa, 1884-1885. In this sense, then, the current Ghana-Togo border to the east and west, respectively, of these two West African nations first emerged as a colonial boundary between the then British Gold Coast, that is Ghana, and a German Togoland, that is Togo. The approximately 1,098 kilometer or 682-mile borderline meanders its way from the Atlantic coastal towns of Aflao in Ghana and Lomé in Togo in the south, all the way to the north, ending on a common point on the southern stretch of the Burkina Faso boundary. Its coastal section to the west of Lomé got done upon an agreement on July 14, 1886, between the British and the Germans who had taken over the Gold Coast and Togoland, respectively. The inland extension along a range of ridges and confluences of water bodies, such as Dakar and Volta rivers, followed later in the Anglo-German Agreement of July 1890, with a further northward extension determined in November 14, 1899. Although the more complete form was mapped out in the closing stages of 1902, the final approval came in June 25, 1904. With the defeat of Germany at the conclusion of the First World War, the promulgation of the League of Nations Mandate of 1919 occasioned the splitting of Togo between Britain and France. To this end, the westernmost part of the former German colony or German Togoland became British Togoland within the British Gold Coast jurisdiction, that is Ghana, with the larger half becoming French Togoland, that is Togo. The details got concluded in October 21, 1929, following extensive demarcation exercises on the part of the British and the French between 1927 and 1929. As the Gold Coast inched towards independence from the British Togoland, which had been administered as part of the former, got officially incorporated and integrated following United Nations plebiscite. Upon French Togoland also becoming independent on April 27, 1960, the common boundary agreed upon by the British and the French remained between the two sovereign West African nations, with slight and inconsequential redemarcation in the 1970s. Thus, in the end, the establishment of this international boundary got done to serve the colonial interests of competing European nations, to the abject neglect of that of the various ethnic groups living alongside it. Of all the indigenous peoples affected by the inconsiderate shifting and establishment of that international boundary, first and foremost, between colonial powers such as Britain and Germany, Britain and France, then the sovereign states of Ghana and Togo, the larger Ewe group suffered the most. The Ewe people are mainly found in Benin, Togo, and Ghana, while majority of them are found between the southeastern section of Ghana and the southernmost part of Togo. The total number of this group in the former country tends to be slightly larger than that of their counterparts in the latter. Although the Ewe never formed a single kingdom or nation, but existed independent of each other, they still cherished their ethnic contiguity, given the shared origins, cultural similarities, family connections, as well as the pleasant interaction that these ties offer them. They have therefore forever disliked that international boundary because it hinders, their ethnic contiguities. Thus, the COVID-imposed closures and limitations implied a drastic cessation of access to official routes, resulting in an increased use of unofficial routes, making the two governments respond with arrests, fines, and imprisonment, not only for violating travelers, but for residents of border towns who must necessarily go back and forth across that international boundary to keep cultural and family ties going. That's the gist of the paper, which I'm writing.
5 minutes left, but if you have more, you have 5 minutes. Otherwise, you're on record pace. Okay, thank you, Kwaku. So that brings the end of our presentations, and we have roughly 30 minutes left for questions and comments from the room. I guess I would ask that you raise your hands, and I will call on you to ask your question or make your comment. I think if it's okay with the panelists, perhaps we'll take 3 at a time. That way there's more of a chance that they're spread across, and everyone gets a chance to hopefully address those. So with that being said, I'm waiting for hands to be raised. I'm not seeing any. You've stunned them into silence. Okay, go ahead, Hisung.
Thank you. Well, thanks all to a wonderful presentation. I have, well, as a political scientist, I have a question to Beth. Very exciting work. And I was wondering whenever you were discussing about the mechanism, so it was a very interesting finding that people who live closer to the border area, they are more likely to support the movement across the border. And I wonder, and then also like remittances, like experience of remittances. And I was wondering, like, as like one possible explanation for that is like, I think you mentioned about that too, but like positive experiences that people actually are having who are living closer to the border area. And to me, it seems like really like the economic experiences. And then maybe as a possible way to examine that possibility, I wonder if like you can interact the distance to the border and the remittances, and to see whether, yeah, there is that like actually the interaction is significant. So I thought that would be an interesting way to test that hypothesis. And then, so I just want to ask you like whether you have some kind of even anecdotal evidence that people living near border area, they are having more kind of positive economic benefits.
Thanks. We have 1 or 2 more. Anybody else want to get in on this in the first round? I'm not seeing any hands. Wait, let me go up and see.
Ken has his hand up.
Ken, okay, yeah. If you can use the function in Zoom would help me a little bit in terms of moderation, because otherwise it's more difficult for me to see that. But go ahead, Ken. You're muted, by the way.
We can't hear you, Ken.
Or if you're not muted, there's something else that's a problem.
Maybe make sure your audio is connected.
You could try typing it in the chat.
Anyone else want to step in while Ken is regaining his audio? I'm going to go to Ingeria. Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is about the soccer players' migration. Excuse me. And my assumption is that this study mainly deals with men, because it's mainly men that travel to play soccer. Is there a corresponding study perhaps done for field and track? Because I would think that women will be represented there. That might indicate the gender variations when it comes to who is migrating and where they're going to.
Okay, thank you, and Jerry. Ken, are you back on? or if you, okay. Ken's got one in the chat. So he says, a question for Matthew. Please comment on whether or not Google Earth has resolved some of the issues you've raised regarding the presentation and perception of Africa. So I think with those three, we can go through this first round of questions. So Beth, and then Wycliffe, and then Matthew.
Great, thanks, Hae-sung, and it's good to see you. So I mean, I think that's a really, I hadn't tried interacting the distance with the remittances, or also just doing a test on remittances, right, to see, using it as the dependent variable and seeing if people closer to the border, you know, based on their proximity to the border, are they more likely to be recipients of remittances. This is like, you know, the limitations of using other people's data, right? Because so Afrobarometer, as you know, is like focused largely on issues of governance and democratization and things like that. So I have pushed for years to have more questions related to migration. I have sent many proposals to Carol and Logan for having more of these questions and haven't gotten there. So I was happy that there's just this question about, like, do you support, you know, free movement? But of course, the remittances question is also very basic, right? Like, do you receive remittances from somebody? And it doesn't say, is it somebody directly across the border? Is it somebody in Europe? Is it somewhere, like, there's no definition of where it's coming from. So so my hope is, like, as I move forward with this, is to try to get out and do some more field research and maybe do some survey experiments, as you've been doing in some of these areas. So I will be in touch, and try to get more at some of these mechanisms, because I think then I could ask more of these questions about, you know, to what extent are they interacting across the border? To what extent are they trading with people? You know, things like that. And I'm especially interested in this, like, co-ethnicity aspect of it, right? Because if it, you know, the data bears out, as I'm seeing in this broad pattern of sort of people who are from these partitioned ethnic groups actually being less supportive of that, then that's something else that needs to be sort of explored more at the micro level, right? So so this is sort of a first cut to look at something that I had observed, you know, very anecdotally years ago, and so now it's you know, it's and yeah, so now I'm getting a chance to come back into it with a different perspective, I guess. So thanks, Hae-sung.
Yes, thanks, Jerry, for the question. For this particular study, the focus was actually only men. But if you broaden the perspective, women in East Africa started playing soccer very late. I think it just started in the 90s. And up to now, they are struggling to have running leagues where the ladies can showcase their talents and have an opportunity to go and play professionally away from East African countries. So yes, although we've had a few that have started doing it, I think we have a few that are now playing in Scandinavian countries, but I don't have data on women playing abroad in soccer. But the experiences are basically the same. When you look at volleyball women, I think for East Africa, and especially for Kenya, actually they were among the pioneers that started to play abroad. We have had Kenyan women because they have always been dominant on the African scene in terms of representing Africa at the Olympic Games. So they have had a lot of exposure, which allowed them to go to play in Japan, to play in Turkey, to play even here in the US. So the more the people are exposed in terms of athletic talent, the higher the opportunity to go and play elsewhere. So for women soccer, they have had limited exposure, and that is a problem. As for track and field, women, of course, came into prominence in the late 1990s, especially for Kenya, and also Uganda. Now, when you go into the 2000s, we have a lot of women, especially from Kenya, that have gone on to run for other countries. Kenya, they have gone on to run, especially for United Arab Emirates and Qatar. And we've had some that have gone to represent Netherlands. And we have had some even here in the US. So women, the more, as I said, the more they are exposed, the more they have an opportunity to go to showcase their talent at higher competitive levels. So it's a question of exposure. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Matthew, if you want to address Ken's question.
Yeah, I think that in some ways, Google Earth has changed the conversation, right? And kind of made the political maps less ubiquitous in views of Africa, and allowed more kind of people to actually make their own maps of the continent. In other ways, I think it has reinforced aspects of the kinds of issues I was talking about, that view of the continent has become even more ubiquitous, that certain projection of Google Earth, Google Maps is more and more, right? That's how my students think the world looks, is that's their view of things. They look up where they are, they're used to looking at that Google map, and that's what they see and what they know. And the fact that, right, that, for instance, in American cities, you can look up transportation, you can look up all of this stuff, right? I can find out how to get somewhere on a bus or a train. Africa.
You're frozen a bit, Matthew, so maybe backtrack. You were talking about American cities being able to use resources to find out how to get where on a bus or a train. But you're still frozen at the moment. I think we have an unstable connection there. Now you're back. Oh, almost.
Matthew, we lost you after a certain point.
Yeah.
Am I back now? Okay. So that American cities, right, have the public transit data, the infrastructure data in there that really isn't there, at least for most parts of Africa, which I think further reinforces my students' belief that Africa doesn't have those things, that there isn't public transportation and there aren't very many roads and people don't drive places. That's well, theoretically, it's opening up new frontiers that in execution, I don't think it's improving things so much. But I had a couple of questions for the other panelists. But for Beth, in terms of looking at this, if there's a difference in regions of conflicts and change over time with conflicts, both in terms of like something like Liberia, Sierra Leone, or Cote d'Ivoire, both in reducing belief in integration, but then once there's a regional response, if that successful regional response then increased belief, and then if there's any kind of religious difference in the data too. And for Wycliffe, if you could talk, you introduced those different, your typology of the players who go abroad. If you could say if that typology wound up affecting the movement patterns you saw at all, if certain players with different motivations went to particular countries or avoided certain countries.
Okay, and I'm going to go with one more question from Francis Musoni. Go ahead, Francis.
Okay, thank you, Todd, and thank you all for very wonderfully presented panel and for the discussion. I have a very general question, and any one of you could just respond to this. I see this is a panel on borders, migration, and mapping. And my question relates to this Africa's Agenda 2063. I don't know if any of you has had any engagements with the documents that are part of this Agenda 2063. And if at all, if you've done some form of engagement with that, do you see any this agenda having any impact in any of the issues that you are engaging with in your research? If not on issues that you are dealing with directly, but at a general level, do you see this agenda having any impact on borders, and cross-border activities in Africa as we think of them at the moment? Do you see any potential impact that this agenda might have? And I'm actually raising this question in light of the recently launched African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is part of the Agenda 2063 framework. So it's a question that any of you could just jump on and respond to. Thank you.
So maybe we can start with Beth and then Wycliffe, and then I'm going to give Kwaku an opportunity to deal with Francis's question if he has anything to comment on that one. So go ahead, guys.
Okay, thanks. So Matthew, it's an interesting thought to try to figure out. So you mentioned changes over time, which would be great to be able to look at. And for this particular survey, it was conducted, it was a one shot, 2014-15. So I can't get sort of whether these change over time. However, the Afrobarometer does different rounds. And if they keep this is the problem with relying on other people's data as well, because if they decide to ditch that question, then I can't look at it over time. But I could look at, I could put in some sort of variable about whether there's been conflict, near that or on the other side of the border where that respondent is located or something like that. So that would be a way. That was part of what I was trying to get at with the refugee camp thing, because clearly they've been affected then by existence of conflict. But it would be possible to since I have that geocoded stuff, it would be possible to try to put in some measure of, was there conflict and things like that. And then also you mentioned regional response. That would be another interesting thing to factor in as well. Like if there was an effective regional response, does that suggest sort of support for regionalism and coming together across borders and things like that? That would be really interesting. Again, those are things that it's harder. The data isn't really in there, but I could try to figure out ways to add it in there. The religious, Afrobarometer does ask their religion. And I could control for that. I don't know that I have a specific hypothesis about what I would expect the role of religion to be. But I could think about that a little bit more. Todd, if it's okay, I do have a brief response to what Francis was asking. And because one reason I think that the Afrobarometer started to ask this question is this movement towards, visa-free. They're claiming, right? The African Union is claiming that by 2023, Africans will be able to move throughout the continent visa-free and all of that. And I'm a bit cynical, I think, about, sort of those top level negotiations versus experiences on the ground. As you were talking about this morning, right? There's lots of issues on the, there's lots of resistance on the ground and in policy. And of course, there's, problems in South Africa and many other countries with xenophobia and other things. And so you have these high level negotiations of free trade and free movement and all of this and these sort of plans, but I don't know that it always matches with sentiment on the ground, right? And I think there's, I think that needs to be overcome some. I think perhaps some of those plans envision sort of free movement of business people, right? But not necessarily free movement of anybody who actually wants to move. So it'll be really interesting to see the tension between those if they, continue to move in that direction as they seem to be, doing. So anyway, I'll stop.
Can I come into?
Yes, Matthew was inquiring about the motivations. In this particular study, I've not looked at the motivations and to specifically narrow down to the individual motivations. But on a broader scale, most of the motivation, first and foremost, is personal development in terms of improving the quality of one's game. When you feel that, when a player feels like he has hit the peak at the level at which he's competing, he is interested in looking for an opportunity to go to play at a league that is of higher quality compared to where he is competing in. And that's why they keep moving from one country to another one, looking for that. So that for those who are very ambitious, that's what they do. But for others who are driven by basically, especially the mercenary ones, they just want to be paid for their talent. Those ones, anywhere where the payment is much better, that's where they go. And that's a pull. So the economic reward is a great pull factor for a lot of the soccer migrant players. And it's just like all of us, you know, as professionals, if we keep moving from one institution to another institution. Why? Because you are given better compensation at the new station compared to the previous station. It is always, I don't think it is reasonable for one to move from one institution to go to another one where he's going to be paid less, unless there are other additional compensating benefits that come with it. And that also happens to soccer players. So just like any other professional, soccer players also assess the cost benefits of moving from one location to another. And the economic aspect is powerful. Of course, others, as I said, once they have acquired enough resources, they have been compensated for their labor, and just looking at extending their participation in the game, the likes of Victor Wanyama and others who are on the eve of retirement, for them, it's not so much the money. Now it just becomes touring the world and enjoying different cultural experiences. And that's where the cosmopolitanism attitude comes in. So yeah, each of those typologies has certain motivations inbuilt within it. And I wish there was more time to go into it, but in a nutshell, that's how it stands. Thank you. And then the one about Musoni, about 2063 agenda. I've not paid much attention on that one, and with its implication for sporting infrastructure. But yes, just like Beth, when it comes to some of those, I'm still skeptical, because when you look at some of what makes soccer in Africa less competitive is just the infrastructure that does not enhance intra-African mobility. Because for sport, there has to be movement. Ease of movement, convenience of movement is key. And in Africa, it is expensive for people in East Africa to go and play in Morocco. They have to go to Europe to go to Morocco. So we still have issues with our own internal movements. And that should be a priority, hopefully, in some of these long vision statements. Because at times we can be good on vision and policy, but when it comes to implementation, we are totally lacking. Thank you.
Kwaku, did you want to add?
Okay, yeah, to add a little bit to efforts at answering Francis's question. I think it's a great idea. I mean, talk about Africa 2063. It's a great idea, but I guess at this point, I would say it's too ambitious and not achievable anytime soon. Why do I say this? Because before this agenda came, there were efforts even at getting the entire African continent operating as one, whatnot. But guess what? The approach to that was said to be, the best approach to that was said to be sub-regional approach. In other words, every sub-region will have to try to come together before you get to the continental something. Take West Africa, for instance. ECOWAS has been on the books trying to, as much as possible, start this effort of bringing the entire region together, the sub-region together. I think the first approach they said had to do with what common currency. They introduced this idea of what common currency. That was a long time ago, and up to today, I don't know how many years that project has been, they've been working at that project, but up to today, 2021, that has still not been achieved. Why? Because one, you have different levels of what development on country to country basis. Not all the countries are on the same page in terms of what development. So we are told that affects the effort to achieve this common currency something, which is an important step, for general unity. Quite apart from that, you also have succeeding governments that come to power that do not tend to be committed to that idea. I hope I understand. Yeah, so you have a certain president buys into that idea, starts it, and I'm not saying the elections are bad, good, we know that, but the problem is with succeeding governments not, picking it up from where they left off, the other ones left off by way of what trying to help the sub-region achieve its vision. So I'm making a point that even at sub-regional levels, there's a big struggle. I hope I understand. Yeah, and it's been in motion for over a long period of time. So I don't know if this is going to work out. The 2063 thing is going to work out, but yes, at sub-regional levels, they've had so many problems. And so I foresee a larger problem when you look at it from the continental something, That's all I would say to you.
Thank you all. Thank you for your responses. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. We started about 5 minutes late, so we could conceivably go till 12:20, but I think I'll call it at that point. So we probably have time for one or two more questions. Beth, you have your hand up, so go ahead.
Thanks. I thought these all were very interesting. How do I take down my hand? Okay, there. So Wycliffe, I had a question for you about sort of, does language play any role? Like I know nothing about soccer players moving out of it. And so like, obviously money is going to be, they want it, but at some point, if they have options in turn that are about the same amount of money, like, are people more looking for a place where, like are people from Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya looking for English speaking countries as priority because they'll be able to better live there and things like that? Or, I mean, does that play any role?
Initially, yes, one would imagine that would be the logical way to go. And if you look at migratory patterns from especially West Africa, I think they go by that because of the Francophone policy was slightly different from the Anglophone policy, because the French accorded the citizens of their colonies some citizenship. So it is very easy for them to transition from their African countries into Europe. And most of them actually enter through France and they move on from there. And even in Central Africa, Congo, they usually go through Belgium and they continue. And the same goes to the Portuguese. From Mozambique, Angola, they go through Portugal and then they move on in earlier times. Now, for the English speaking, it is a very open system. So as a matter of fact, Kenya's entry into international soccer, for example, started with their Kenyans going to play in Sweden or going to play in Arab countries, Middle East. Very minimal cultural connection, except for Kenya, for example, along the coast and Tanzania. So over time, language has not been a barrier at all. And and looking at the different countries where they are applying their trade, most of them go to places where the language is not common, no common cultural foundations, and they seem to thrive. Even when you go to a track and field, the same applies. People go to Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, or Turkey, And there is no common language connection there. So yes, in some cases, for some, yes, but one of the reasons that for a long time, people went to English-speaking countries, especially from East Africa, the English-speaking East Africans. When they went there, they went for academic pursuits. They didn't go for sporting talent because of sporting reasons. And that is the channel that has been identified. When you go to England, when you come to US, mainly it is for academic reasons. But for sporting reasons, you go elsewhere. Of course, we have a few that still pursue that line, but most of them, that's not a big issue.
They all speak the language of soccer, huh?
Oh yeah, because the language of the soccer is universal. So wherever it is, that's why you see even from Burundi and Rwanda, you'll think that they'll go to Belgium because they had some colonial connection, but they don't. They are going to other places. And I also have something in the chat for you. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, but I have
I think we'll go to an audience member and then we'll come back to yours in a moment, Wycliffe.
Okay.
So Aaron McKinnon, I'll let you ask your question and then I'll get to Wycliffe's question for Beth.
Great, thank you. Very briefly, I really enjoyed all the presentations. As I was listening to them, and this is perhaps more for Beth and Kwaku, but I was wondering if there's any virtue or if the actual site of the border itself is worthy of study, the political, social, and economic activity. You know, a couple of years ago, I had the great fortune to actually make the land crossing from Ghana to Togo into Benin. And I was really struck by the buzz of activity and all that's going on. And so that was one question, you know, to understand the broader issues, especially when thinking about Beth's temporal analysis or spatial analysis of deeper into areas. What about the border itself? And quickly for Wycliffe, given the recent World Cup and France's success, shouldn't we really be talking about European teams as African teams now anyway?
Okay, and thank you, Aaron. And then a final one for Beth from Wycliffe. He says that your presentation reminds him of the English idiom. It's the wearer of the shoe that knows where the shoe pinches. What is your take on that? So we'll try to wrap up here in the next 5 minutes. So let's have at it.
Okay, I don't know if you wanted me to go first or Kwaku.
Whoever wants to jump in at this point. We're over time officially, so we're in free-for-all mode.
Right. I can be quick. I mean, Aaron, I think that's a great, I think, yes, the border areas are really interesting to study. And there is a whole, you know, body of research on borderlands, right? And so my hope, you know, depending on funding and COVID restrictions ending and things like that, is to be able to get out and do some more, like what I would like to do is do some more micro level surveys in border areas and away from border areas, right? And then be able to tease out some of these things. And I think there's, you know, with it, you know, closest to the border versus, you know, 50 kilometers away or something, it would be great to be able to do at different locations. But there is, you're right, there are these thriving economies along these borders in many cases. Even when they're closed, right? So I think that's, and Wycliffe, I love that quote. I hadn't heard it before, but I think it's exact. I mean, I think it does speak to the fact that, you know, this, as I said, I was really struck by this when I was doing my dissertation research, that, you know, people in the areas where the camps were could speak in great detail about how they had been affected both positively and negatively, right? And they really saw all the nuances of it. But you get farther away where all they see is media coverage or hear about it or whatever, and they don't have that same nuance, right? And I think that's and you see that at play in other places as well. So, but I have copied down that quote. I might have to use it. So.
Yeah, Aaron, it's interesting that you mentioned that. European countries are basically looking African like us. It is fascinating to watch even countries like the Czech Republic. You watch Poland, very interior, you know, middle of Europe. And now when you watch, you are seeing a lot of people like me in their national teams. And that is a whole topic of its own, and that's not what I focused on today. But But as that is happening, because of also the media and the transnational nature of the media, that again it is attracting more, because if they see a Black guy can make it in Poland, he can make it in Denmark, why not me? And so it is drawing more to go that side. That's why the challenge in Africa is big. How can we keep these talents home? If we don't improve our structures, if we don't improve the remuneration of our own players and the compensation for our talents back in Africa, I think we shall see a lot more going abroad to seek greener pastures. Thank you.
Okay, so quickly, yeah, certainly the economic activity, is quite impressive, especially around the official entry point and entry and exit points. At the same time, there's let's talk about underground economy that also goes on, economic activity that also goes on in unofficial places, especially for smugglers. But my interest is particularly with border town communities, towns in in Ghana, very close to towns in Togo along the line as the border was. And you have some, a child, living in Ghana and going to school in Togo, and you have families, close families living on either side of the border. These are some of the interesting ones. Yes, so the economic activity, great. But as I said, my interest is in, those communities where you have families living on either side of the boundary, and school children, going across the boundary to attend school. These are some of the interesting activities that I also am interested in. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And with that, I think that we've reached the end of our session. And I want to thank the panelists really for making my job easy by keeping to time and not struggling with them through Zoom. And I want to thank the audience members in the room for engaging and really asking a fascinating suite of questions. So that being said, we're going to bring this one to a close. The CERSIS business meeting is taking place in a different room, is starting in about 6 to 8 minutes. Grab some lunch, sit in on that one. There's some elections that need to happen. There's other business that typically happens. If you're not familiar with the structure of CERSIS and its relationship with Sean, etc., you may find that enlightening. And so I encourage you to attend that meeting. And thank you again.
Thanks,